Hello children, how are you? I hope you all are doing well. So children, we must have realized that through English literature, we come to know about so many different things, isn't it? So we know about different people, the personalities, the nature, the beauty of the nature, everything we come to know through English literature. At the same time, we learn some moral values also. So now in this chapter called The Cake, we are going to talk about a passage which was published from this novel Anna of Green Gables, okay, and see what is the story about, okay, what is this telling us about Annie Shirley, okay, who was a young orphan. And let's see what happens to her and what is the story with regards. Okay, now let's see the prologue. Annie of Green Gables, published in 1908, is a classic novel by L.M. Montgomery. It tells the story of Annie Shirley, a young orphan girl who is adopted by Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert. The Cuthberts, who are brother and sister, live on a farm called Green Gables in Avonlea, Prince Edward Island, Canada, and they love Annie like a daughter. In the following story, a new minister of the church and his wife have come to live in Avonlea. Avonlea is a small rural community and the minister is an important and influential part of it. In those days, most activities in a village revolved around the church and the minister was usually familiar with all the families in the community. The role of the minister's wife was to work with the community and help those in need. Very often, the minister's wife would also teach in the local school. Read on to find out about the minister's visit to the Cuthberts' home. So, ये स्टोरी है एनी शर्ली की, ओके, जो एक अनाथ होती है और उसको अडॉप्ट करते हैं मैथ्यू एंड मैरिला कर्थबर्ट. ये दो जो होते हैं, दे आर ब्रदर एंड सिस्टर. तो वो उसको अपनी डॉटर की जैसे ट्रीट करते हैं और फिर उस जो गांव में रहते हैं वहाँ पे एक नए मिनिस्टर अपॉइंट होते हैं और उनकी वाइफ वहाँ पे शिफ्ट होते हैं. एंड देन लेट्स टॉक अबाउट दिस स्टोरी, ओके, हाउ दिस मिनिस्टर, ओके, दे यूज्ड टू, वो छोटा सा गांव था, दे हैड दिस, तभी उस टाइम पे चर्च के काफ़ी सारे एक्टिविटीज़ होते थे. सो दिस मिनिस्टर एंड हिज वाइफ वो जाते हैं कर्थबर्ट्स की फैमिली को मिलने. So let's see what happens at their home. Okay. So first, before that, let's do a warm-up. Discuss and answer. How would you feel if you faced an awkward and embarrassing situation? अगर आपकी लाइफ में कुछ awkward moment आता है या embarrassing situation आती है, आपको कैसे लगता है? Okay, and how do you deal with that situation? Alright, now let's read this chapter. The new minister and his wife were a young, pleasant-faced couple, still full of enthusiasm for their chosen life work. Avonlea opened its heart to them from the start. Everyone liked the cheerful young man and the bright, gentle lady who was his wife. Annie fell promptly in love with Mrs. Allen. She had discovered another kindred spirit. So, जो न्यू मिनिस्टर और वाइफ अपॉइंट होते हैं, पीपल दे आर लाइक यंग प्लेजेंट कपल और उनको अच्छे से लोग दे ग्रीट देम, दे वेलकम देम इन देयर टाउन, ओके, इन देयर टाउन कॉल्ड एवनली. तो जैसे ही एनी उनको देखती है, इवन शी फॉल्स इन लव विद मिसेस एलन. ओके, सो मिसेस एलन इज लवली, शी अनाउंस्ड. शी इज टेकन आवर क्लास एंड शी इज अ स्प्लेंडेड टीचर. She said we could ask her questions we liked and I asked her so many. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla. So Annie is telling that कि Mrs. Allen जो है वो उसने हमारी क्लास ली and she's been like a really very good teacher. और उन्होंने कहा कि आपको जो सवाल पूछने पूछो, तो मैंने बहुत सारे सवाल पूछे. So I believe you was Marilla's reply. I suppose we must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen to tea soon, said Marilla reflectively. I've heard they have been everywhere but here. Let me see. Next Wednesday would be a good time to have them. So Marilla decides to invite them for tea at their place. So then they have shortlisted on Wednesday to call. Oh, Marilla, will you let me make a cake? Said Annie. I'd love to do something for Mrs. Allen, and you know I can make a good cake. You can make a layer cake, promised Marilla. Throughout Monday and Tuesday, great preparations went on at Green Gables. Having the minister and his wife to tea was an important matter, and Marilla was determined not to be outdone by any of the Avonlea housekeepers. Annie was wild with excitement. She talked it all over with her friend Diana as they sat on the big red stones by the Dryad's bubble. Everything is ready, Diana, except my cake, which I am to make in the morning, and the baking powder biscuits which Marilla will make. Oh, Diana, Marilla and I have had a busy 2 days of it. I have never had such an experience before. You should see our pantry. We are to have 2 kinds of jelly, red and yellow, and whipped cream, and lemon pie, and cherry pie, and 3 kinds of biscuits, and fruit cake, and Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves that she keeps especially for ministers, and pound cake, and layer cake. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Dinah, what if it isn't any good? So, इतनी तैयारियां चलती है to welcome this minister and his wife at their house. They are like 2 दिन पहले से ही वो सारे प्रिपरेशन शुरू हो जाती है उसके घर में, और Annie is so excited. वो अपनी दोस्त को बता रही थी डायना को कि क्या क्या प्रिपरेशंस हुए, क्या क्या उन्होंने बना के रखा है, उनके पैंट्री में क्या क्या सजा के रखा है. 2 किस्म की जेलीज है, बिस्किट्स हैं, केक्स होने वाले हैं. सो शी इज़ टेलिंग एवरीथिंग विथ सो मच ऑफ एक्साइटमेंट. और उसको एक मन में ये भी डर है कि मैं जो केक बनाऊंगी मैं वो उसी दिन सुबह बनाऊंगी. सो आई होप दैट इट टर्न्स आउट वेल, एंड अगर वो नहीं अच्छा हुआ तो क्या करूँ. सो ऑब्वियसली अगर आपके घर पे भी कोई मेहमान आते हैं तो आप देखोगे कि आपके पेरेंट्स जो है काफ़ी सारी प्रिपरेशंस करते हैं, एंड दे ऑलवेज वरीड दैट होप द फूड टर्न्स आउट वेल. अगर नहीं हुआ तो क्या सोचेंगे आपके बारे में या उनके बारे में. Isn't this what your parents think when they have guests over? So that was the same worry here with Annie. It will be good, all right, said Diana. Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out badly just when you want them to be a good one, sighed Annie. However, I suppose I shall just have to trust that it will turn out well. Wednesday morning came. Annie got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She had caught a severe cold by playing in the spring the previous evening, but nothing short of pneumonia could have stopped her that morning. After breakfast, she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door, she drew a long breath. So, Annie इतनी एक्साइटेड थी कि उसको रात भर नींद ही नहीं आई, क्योंकि वेडनेसडे आ गया था, और वेडनेसडे आते ही वो जल्दी से बेड से उठ गई और उसको कोल्ड भी हो गया था. बट शी जस्ट इग्नोर्ड इट एंड शी स्टार्टेड प्रिपेयरिंग हर केक. ओके, और जब उसने उसको ओवन में डाल दिया, शी वाज लाइक शी टुक अ ब्रेथ ऑफ रिलीफ कि चलो हो गया. आई एम श्योर आई हैवंट फॉरगॉटन एनीथिंग दिस टाइम, Marilla, but do you think it will rise? Just suppose the baking powder isn't good? Mrs. Lind says you can never be sure of getting good baking powder nowadays. Marilla, what if that cake doesn't rise? We'll have plenty without it, was Marilla's way of looking at the problem. So, Annie की टेंशन ये थी कि आपको तो पता है जब केक को आप ओवन ट्रे में डालते हो तो इट इज़ लाइक अ gooey थिंग, ओके, और वो धीरे धीरे वो इट rises and gets baked. तो उसके बेक करने के लिए उसमें बेकिंग पाउडर डालते हैं. सो शी इज़ वरीड कि अगर बेकिंग पाउडर अच्छी नहीं होगी तो क्या वो केक राइस करेगा. सो दैट वाज हर वरी. बट मैरिला को जब वो बताती है तो मैरिला हैज़ एन आंसर कि डोंट वरी, उसके बिना भी हमारे पास काफ़ी सारी चीज़ें हैं. ओके, द केक डिड राइज हाउएवर एंड केम आउट ऑफ द oven as light and feathery as golden foam. Annie clapped it together with layers of ruby jelly and imagined Mrs. Allen eating it and asking for another piece. So she started, but उसका डर तब रुक गया जब उसने देखा कि the cake rose, okay, and then it was the perfect one, just like the way she wanted, light and feathery, okay. So she was very happy, she was very excited. उसने जल्दी जल्दी उसको she put the layers of ruby jelly on it, okay, and she prepared it. You will be using the best tea set, of course, Marilla, she said. And can I set the table with ferns and wild roses? I think that's all nonsense, sniffled Marilla. So now Annie wanted to also decorate the table. But Marilla को लगता है कि ये तो it is all nonsense. Mrs. Barry had her table decorated, said Annie. Well, do as you like, said Marilla, but leave enough room for the dishes and the food. Annie did decorate the table in such a manner that when the minister and his wife sat down to it, they exclaimed together over its loveliness. It's Annie's handiwork, said Marilla, and Annie felt that Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness for this world. सो ऑफकोर्स जब मैं एनी ने उनको बताया कि मिसेस बैरी ने तो बहुत अच्छे से सब कुछ सजाया था, सो मैरीला टोल्ड एनी कि तुम्हें जो करना है करो. सो एनी डिड डेकोरेटेड इन सच अ मैनर कि उसमें खाना रखने की भी जगह है, एट द सेम टाइम इट इज़ लुकिंग प्रिटी ऑल्सो. And Mrs. Allen, when she saw it, she was like pretty happy. और तो मैरीला कहती है ये सारा एनी के हाथों का कमाल है. Okay, so now children, let's track your performance through this performance tracker. Let's see how much you followed the story so far. All right, now let's move ahead. All went as well as could be until Annie's layer cake was passed around. Mrs. Allen helped herself to a plump triangle, as did also the minister and Marilla. Mrs. Allen took a mouthful of hers and a strange expression crossed her face, but she didn't say a word and steadily ate away at it. Marilla saw her expression and quickly tasted the cake. So, सब कुछ अच्छा जा रहा था और फिर बारी आई केक की. ओके, एंड द केक वॉज पास्ड और वहाँ से एक बड़ा सा ट्रायंगुलर पीस ले लिया मिसेस एलन ने, और जैसे उन्होंने मुंह में डाला उनका एक्सप्रेशन चेंज हो गया, जो मैरिला ने नोटिस किया. ओके, और फिर उन्होंने जल्दी से टेस्ट करके देखा केक को. एंड देन शी स्टार्टेड शाउटिंग, "Annie, surely," she exclaimed. "What on earth did you put into the cake?" "Nothing. But what the recipe said, Marilla," said Annie. "Isn't it all right?" "All right. It's simply horrible, Mr. Allen. Don't try to eat it." "Annie, taste it yourself. What flavoring did you use?" "Vanilla," said Annie, her face red with embarrassment after tasting the cake. "Only vanilla? Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder." "Baking powder? Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used." Annie fled to the pantry and returned with a small bottle filled with a brown liquid and labeled "Best Vanilla." Marilla took it, uncorked it, smelled it. So she जैसे मैरिला ने वो टेस्ट किया, शी स्टार्टेड शाउटिंग और एनी को पूछा कि तुमने इसमें डाला क्या है. तो उसने बोला कि वही जो रेसिपी में लिखे थे वही इंग्रेडिएंट्स डाले हैं. तो कहते तुमने इसमें एसेंस कौन सा, फ्लेवर कौन सा डाला है? तो कहते हैं वेनिला. तो कहते हैं जाओ वो बॉटल लेके आओ जो वेनिला की तुमने डाले. सो वो लेके आती है. ओके, और जब मैरिला उसको खोलती है, अनकॉक करती है एंड स्मेल करती है, देन शी इज़ लाइक, "Oh Annie, you have flavored that cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week and poured what was left into an empty vanilla bottle. I suppose it's partly my fault. I should have warned you, but why couldn't you have smelled it?" So उसने पूछा कि तुमने डाला क्या है. तब वो जब स्मेल करती है तो उसमें वो उसको पता चलता है कि उसने एनोडाइन लिनिमेंट डाला है. अब ये क्या होता है? ये एक मेडिसिनल लिक्विड होता है. जब आपको कोई मस्कुलर पेन हो या स्टिफनेस हो तब आप पेन वो लगाते हैं ना, जैसे हम बाम लगाते हैं, उसी टाइप का एक लिनिमेंट होता है जिसकी बॉटल फूट गई थी. इसके लिए उसमें जो भी दवाई बची थी वो मैरिला ने उस बॉटल में, एम्प्टी बॉटल में डाल दी थी. एंड शी फॉरगॉट टू टेल एनी अबाउट इट. ओके, और इसके लिए वो कहती कि इट वॉज माई फॉल्ट ऑल्सो टू सम एक्सटेंट, बट यू शुड हैव एटलीस्ट स्मेल्ट इट, ओके, before you put it in the cake. Annie burst into tears under this double disgrace. "I couldn't. I had such a cold." And with this, she fled to her room, where she threw herself on the bed and wept. तो जब वो बोलती तुम स्मेल तो करना चाहिए, तो कहती मैं नहीं कर पाई क्योंकि मुझे ज़ुकाम हो गया था. So and then she just went to the room and she started crying. Soon a light step sounded on the stairs and somebody entered the room. "Oh, Marilla," sobbed Annie, without looking up. "I am disgraced forever. I shall never be able to live this down." Dinah will ask me how my cake turned out, and I shall have to tell her the truth. I shall always be pointed at as the girl who flavored a cake with anodyne liniment. The boys in school will never get over laughing at me. Oh, Marilla, I cannot ever look Mrs. Allen in the face again. Perhaps she'll think I tried to poison her. But the liniment isn't poisonous. Won't you tell Mrs. Allen so, Marilla? Suppose you tell her so yourself, said a kind voice. So, ये इतनी टेंशन में आ गई थी, इतना इसको बुरा लग रहा था कि क्या अभी मुझे डायना को भी बताना पड़ेगा, वो तो मुझे पूछेगी केक कैसे था. सो आई हैव टू टेल हर द ट्रुथ. स्कूल में भी सारे बच्चे मेरा मजाक उड़ा देंगे. क्या तुम मतलब उसको लगता है कि उसके रूम में मेरिला आई है. ओके तो मेरिला को बोलती कि क्या तुम मिसेस एलन को बता सकते हो कि मैं इट वाज नॉट पॉइजनस. ओके आई डिड नॉट ट्राई टू पॉइजन और समथिंग लाइक दैट. तो there was a kind voice that Annie hears, okay, and that voice says, suppose you tell her so yourself, said a kind voice. Annie jumped up to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed, looking at her with laughing eyes. My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this, she said. So up now Mrs. Allen is trying to pacify her and telling her, you should not cry like this, my girl. It's all just a funny mistake that anybody might make. Okay, oh no, it takes me to make such a mistake, said Annie sadly. And I wanted to make such a nice cake for you, Mrs. Allen. Yes, I know, dear, and appreciate your thoughtfulness just as much as if it had turned out all right. Now you mustn't cry anymore, but come down with me and show me your flower garden. So she said, like, I'm so sorry about whatever I have given. I wanted to give you the best. Okay, but Mrs. Allen tells her that it's okay, you know, it's just a funny mistake that you have done. और वो किसी के साथ भी हो सकता है. चलो अब नीचे आ जाओ और मुझे अपना flower garden दिखा दो. So Annie permitted herself to be let down and comforted. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake. And when the guest went away, Annie found that she had enjoyed the evening more than she had expected, but she sighed deeply. तो ऑल्दो सब गेस्ट जाने के बाद एनी को लगा कि उसने इवनिंग तो बहुत एंजॉय किए, बट उसके मन ही मन में वो एक दुख तो था दैट द केक डिड नॉट टर्न आउट वेल. ओके Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet? I'll guarantee you'll make plenty in it, said Marilla. I have never seen such talent for making mistakes, Annie. Yes, I know, said Annie. But have you ever noticed one encouraging thing about me, Marilla? I never make the same mistake twice. I don't know if that's any good when you are always making new ones. Oh, don't you see, Marilla? There must be a limit to the mistakes one person can make, and when I get to the end of them, then I'll be done with them. That's a very comforting thought. Well, you'd better go and give that cake to the pigs, said Marilla. So, आफ्टर दैट यू नो एनी एंड मरीला दोनों एक दूसरे से बातें करते. तभी वो बोलती है, मरीला क्या ऐसे कुछ हो सकता है कि एक दिन ऐसा हो सकता है जब हम कोई मिस्टेक्स ना करें एंड द डे गो स्मूथली. सो मरीला सेज दैट आई हैव नेवर सीन सच ए टैलेंट कि जो कोई मिस्टेक ही नहीं हुई हो दिन में. सो शी इज़ लाइक यू नो बट हैव यू रियलाइज मरीला कि जो मैं एक मिस्टेक जो मैं एक बार करती हूँ मैं दोहराती नहीं हूँ. आई डू नॉट मेक द सेम मिस्टेक अगेन. So it's like, you know, Marilla tells her that I don't know if that's any good when you are always making a new one. मतलब शायद तुम same mistake दोहरा नहीं रही हो, but you are making a new one every day. तो daily हम लोग कोई ना कोई गलतियाँ करते ही रहते हैं. But yes, so as Annie said, it is wise not to repeat your mistakes. So children, we can also learn from this. Okay, mistakes will happen on a daily basis. हमेशा कोई ना कोई नई mistake तो होती रहेगी. So children, do not repeat your mistakes, learn from them and do well in life. Alright, so children, हमेशा अपने life में ऐसे embarrassing situations आती रहेगी. You don't have to worry, okay, just move on. Alright, so now quickly reread this chapter, look at the difficult words, learn their meanings, their spellings, and do not forget to do the back exercises.